All right, welcome everyone as you're joining us. It's 2 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Katie Stolp. I'm the local history librarian here at Appleton Public Library, and this is our March session of Find Your Ancestors. For those who aren't familiar with the Find Your Ancestors series, we do this every month, so hopefully you will be able to join us. You know, as the pandemic continues, join us from wherever. We're always going to have a virtual element. So our April topic is going to be on UK and Irish websites, and that's going to be April 17th. And there is a link to register for that program in the handout. On May 15th, we're going to be talking about Mayflower genealogy. So there's also a link to register for that in the handout. And I'll post the link to the handout a few times throughout the session today if you missed it when you first got in. There's also a link in the handout to sign up for our local history and genealogy newsletter, where I send out emails about once a month or so, sometimes less than that, just letting you know about our programs and what genealogy databases and services the library has. So you can feel free to sign up for that. My contact email and phone number is also in the handout if you have any questions or want some help with your genealogy research. You can also let me know if you have a speaker or an idea for a future Find Your Ancestors topic. This session is being recorded and we're going to post it on our YouTube channel. You'll also be able to find several of our other recordings of the Find Your Ancestors program on our YouTube channel. And there's also a link to the YouTube channel in the handout. If you have any questions during today's session, you can either write them in the chat box, or at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A box where you can type in questions and we'll answer those at the end of the presentation. At the end of the presentation, we also have a survey from Project Outcome, which is a library-sponsored initiative, just giving us feedback on what you thought of the program and what you learned. There will be a link that I'll post in the chat. Otherwise, once we exit Zoom, it'll pop up in a browser for you. It's just a short 8 questions, no pressure to answer it, but if you'd like, it really helps us out. So now I can introduce today's speaker. Today's speaker is Russ Horton. Russ is the Reference and Outreach Archivist at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, which is in Madison, Wisconsin, and I highly recommend you go visit it. It's an awesome museum. I've been there myself, both for research and for fun. And at the museum, Russ helps researchers from genealogists to professional historians learn the stories of Wisconsin's veterans. So everyone, welcome Russ.
Thanks, Katie. I want to thank Katie and the Appleton Public Library for inviting me to speak. It's always nice to speak to some different audiences, and this virtual program gives me the chance to talk to folks from all over the country. So that's really great too. My presentation today is going to focus on World War II genealogy, but I want to make sure that all of you know that at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, we do also have resources to help you research ancestors from the Civil War through the present. And even if we don't have the documents that will help you, or the particular materials that will help you learn about your ancestor, we can almost certainly point you in the right direction. So please feel free to reach out to us if you have questions outside of World War II. All right, so I'm going to make sure that, there we go. So we just completed the 75th anniversary of World War II. While the Civil War is the most widely studied conflict in American history, World War II has to be the second. It was truly a global conflict. It affected just about every single human being on the planet in one way or another. And unlike the Civil War, most of us probably know someone who participated in World War II, either overseas or on the home front. All of that combines to form a pretty strong interest in learning more about the people who took part in it. So, sorry, I'm just kind of getting the hang of these controls here. Okay, in terms of beginning to research people from World War II, I like to compare military jargon to a foreign language and military culture to a foreign country. Some of you have probably done research in foreign countries, either by mail, email, or in person. In addition to the problems that foreign languages can cause for genealogists, it can also be very difficult to navigate cultural differences. Where are the records kept in a different culture? Are the records similar to the records here? Do certain terms and phrases mean the same thing here as they do there? So I'm going to suggest that treating World War II a little like a foreign country might actually help you quite a bit in your research. When you get into some of the sources that I'm going to discuss today, you're going to start seeing abbreviations and terms that make no sense to you. You'll find documents that you think mean one thing, but actually mean something slightly different. You might discover that you're searching for information in the wrong place or the wrong time. You can certainly email me for help. My email address should be in the handout you received. But I know lots of you like to figure things out by yourselves. That's part of the fun of genealogy, right? So I'm going to suggest that learning a little about the history, the people, the organizations, and the language of World War II can help you to decipher the sources and know where to look for additional information. I'm not suggesting you go out and get a history degree. Believe me, they're not really that useful in the real world. I have one myself. But a little preparation can go a long way. So one of the first things to understand about World War II involves dates. And when I give this presentation in person, I usually ask the audience this question, but I'll just kind of make it as more of a statement now and say that I would guess that most Americans, if you ask them when World War II began, would tell you 1941 or maybe even 1940. But World War II actually began September 1st, 1939. The United States did not officially enter until December 8th, 1941, almost 2 full years after the war began. And for our purposes today, why does that matter? It matters because roughly 10,000 Americans had already joined the fighting by the time the US entered World War II, either through the British or the Royal Canadian Forces. And some of you might have relatives who fall into that group. We're only going to talk about American sources today, but I wanted you to all be aware of this. And if you do have questions about this type of service, please feel free to reach out about that. We can help you find the right places to look. Also, before December 8th, 1941, the United States passed the Selective Service Act in September of 1940. This created the first peacetime draft in US history. Men were drafted beginning in October 1940 for 1 year of service, although that was later extended. So it is very possible that some of you have ancestors who were drafted before World War II even began. Closer to home, the Wisconsin National Guard and the Michigan National Guard were called into active duty on October 15th, 1940, and they were sent to train in Louisiana. In the summer of 1941, they participated in the Louisiana Maneuvers, which was the largest peacetime maneuver in US history. So thousands of Wisconsin men were serving in the active military more than a year before the country declared war. This is important to consider when searching for information. Your World War II ancestor story might very well have started before the US entered the war. Of course, Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, 1941, and the United States declared war the following day. From that point, the American military expanded very quickly. When I give a talk about Civil War genealogy, I stress the point that having at least a little understanding of the organization of the military can really help you understand what you're looking for. In the roughly 80 years between the Civil War and World War II, the United States military became exponentially more complicated. So it is even more true for us in our discussion today. All right, so approximately 16 million men and women served in the American military during World War II. About 215,000 served in the Coast Guard, with a similar number serving in the Merchant Marines. Roughly 485,000 joined the United States Marine Corps. The Army Air Forces, which were technically part of the Army during World War II, but are pretty easily distinguishable, oversaw more than 2 million in service. The Navy had over 4 million during the war, but surpassing them all by a large margin was the United States Army, with between 8 and 10 million soldiers. So with all due respect to the brave Coast Guard and Merchant Marine veterans, even when you combine them, they make up less than 2% of the American military during World War II. So I'm not going to spend time talking about them this afternoon. But again, if you have questions about them, if you have an ancestor who was in one of those two branches, please feel free to reach out to me outside of this and I can give you a hand. It leaves us with the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Army, Air Force, and the Army. And I'm going to briefly go over each of these branches, talking a little bit about their organization and show you how knowing just a little about this can make your search a lot easier. So starting out with the Marine Corps, the first thing to note is that they served almost exclusively in the Pacific theater. So if you have an ancestor who served in the Marines during World War II, that already makes your job a little bit easier. You know they served in the Pacific somewhere. So as I mentioned earlier, almost 500,000 Marines took part in World War II, with roughly 20,000 dying during the war. And while there were Marine aviation units, Marine artillery units, and Marine engineering units, to name just a few, the vast majority of Marines were riflemen. Very roughly speaking, about 100 of those riflemen were put into a company. 3 companies made up a battalion of more than 300 men. 3 battalions made up a regiment of close to 1,000 men. And 3 infantry regiments, along with an artillery regiment and a special troops, made up a Marine division of more than 4,000 men. So you can see that knowing the division your ancestor served in is helpful, but not quite as helpful as knowing what regiment he or she served in, and so on down the line. There were 6 Marine divisions during World War II and 29 Marine regiments, including artillery and engineers. I've summed up on this slide how they were arranged. And any number over 6 instantly tells you that you're talking about a regiment. You can see that knowing which regiment your ancestor served in can tell you if he was in infantry, artillery, or engineers as well. To make it a little more complicated, in Marine jargon, the 3rd Marine Regiment is often simply called the 3rd Marines. The 3rd Marine Division, though, is called the 3rd Marine Division. So you could see someone who served in the 3rd Marines, 3rd Marine Division, and they're not being repetitive. You also might see something along the lines of 2nd, 3rd Marines. This does not mean that your ancestor was only considered 2/3 of a full Marine. It signifies that he served in the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines. So hopefully you're beginning to see how, understanding a little bit about this can help you to understand some of the jargon that you might run into as you begin your research. All right. So over 4 million men and women served in the Navy during World War II. Like the Marine Corps, the Navy was complex and had aviation units, ground units, and more, in addition to the stereotypical sailor. Even among the sailors, there were many, many different types of ships and dozens of different ratings. Ratings are like a combination of rank and specialty in the Army. They have relatively descriptive names that suggest what the sailor did as part of their duties. I've put some of the ratings on this slide just to give you an idea of them. Unlike the Marines, who were concentrated in the Pacific theater, veterans from the Navy could have served just about anywhere in the world: Europe, the North Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Pacific, and the China-Burma-India theater. Their missions ranged from transporting troops and equipment and searching for enemy submarines to attacking enemy ships and launching various aircraft. Finding out your Navy veteran's rating and his or her assignment, whether it was to a special unit or to a ship, should be your first focus. And I'll discuss where to find that information a little later. All right, so next we're going to go to the Army Air Forces. They contributed roughly 2 million to the war effort. So today we have 4 major branches of service, right? The Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. Leading up to and during World War II, though, there were only 3 major branches: the Army, the Navy, and the Marines. The roots of the Air Force began in 1907 when the Army Signal Corps formed an aeronautical division. In 1914, that changed its name to the Aviation Section, but remained part of the Signal Corps. Following World War I, it became the Army Air Service, and in 1926, the Army Air Corps. Just as the United States was about to enter World War II in 1941, the organization changed its name again to the United States Army Air Forces. It would keep that name until after the war, when in 1947 it became its own separate branch of service known as the United States Air Force. That's a lot of organizational history, and the only part that's really relevant to us today is that during World War II, the Air Force was still a component of the Army called the Army Air Forces, although you will see it referred to at times as the Army Air Corps, the AAC. So if you see AAF or AAC somewhere, that's probably what it means. When we think of the Army Air Forces in World War II, we probably think of pilots and navigators and gunners flying on huge bombers like B-17s and B-24s, or on fighters like P-38s and P-51s. But there were plenty of veterans who spent their service on the ground as engineers, mechanics, administrators, officers, and more. For purposes of saving time, though, I'm going to talk mainly and briefly about the veterans who flew on various planes during the war. In terms of organization, it's somewhat similar to the Marine Corps. You'll remember that the Marines use companies to make up battalions, battalions to make up regiments, regiments to make up divisions. The Army Air Forces used squadrons to make up groups, groups to make up wings, and wings to make up air forces. There were 16 separate air forces numbered 1 through 15 and also 20. There were 91 wings, 269 groups, and over 800 squadrons. You might have heard of groups like the 8th Air Force or the 332nd Fighter Group, but that is how they relate in terms of size. By finding out the Air Force that your ancestors served in, you can get an idea of where in the world they served, as you can see on this slide. CBI, by the way, stands for China, Burma, India. All right, and last, certainly not least, is the United States Army. The largest of the US armed forces in World War II, more Americans were in the Army than all the other service branches combined. Where there were 6 Marine divisions and 16 Air Forces, there were 92 Army divisions that served in World War II. And those 92 divisions weren't all the same. There were infantry, airborne, mountain infantry, armored, cavalry, and artillery divisions in the Army. The largest unit in this branch was called, appropriately, an army. Armies were composed of corps, which were made up of divisions, which were made up of regiments, which were made up of companies. This slide will give you an idea of where armies and divisions were stationed, another example of how knowing a little about this history and context can help you in your search for more information. Okay, so that's a lot of information to digest. And it might seem like it makes a lot of, it might not seem like it makes a lot of sense right now, but that's okay. I mostly wanted to get through to you all that the US military in World War II is incredibly complex, and you can't just jump into researching an ancestor who served in it and expect to understand everything. It is worth taking some time to either ask someone who knows more about it to help you, or to do a little bit of research yourself. That was a very broad, general, and impersonal look at World War II history. I want to spend the rest of my time with you doing what genealogists do and making it a little more personal. Tracing Private Ryan, I have to say that feels like a pretty catchy title. I was very proud when I came up with it. I will admit, though, that it was my second choice. When I started developing this presentation, I decided that I wanted to use my own grandfather as an example throughout it. This is my grandpa, but to be honest, when I put his name into the title, it just didn't really seem to roll off the tongue quite as easily. I don't know what you all think, but tracing Private Nurkowski does seem a little more awkward. So with all apologies to my mother's Polish side of the family, I decided to go with the more broadly appealing Tracing Private Ryan, though I'm still going to use my Grandpa Nurkowski as an example throughout. So when you're researching World War II veterans, what are some of the basic questions we all ask? When and where did they join the military? What unit did they serve in? What was their job in that unit? When and where did they serve overseas? Were they in any battles? What medals did they receive? When did they leave the military? How great would it be if there was one magical document that answered all of those questions? These are the questions that I get from researchers every day, very super duper common questions. And if there was one document that answered them all, it would just be fantastic. And we're in luck because for the most part, there is such a document. You might hear it called slightly different things. Some people call it a DD-214. Some people call it a separation record or a discharge paper, and I will be using those terms interchangeably throughout this presentation. But whatever you call it, it is a great source of information about an individual World War II veteran, perhaps the best source of information about him or her. It will answer most of the questions you have, and some you probably didn't even think to ask. It will also point you toward new areas of research so that you can find out even more about your veteran's experience in the war. I wouldn't say that it is impossible to research a World War II veteran without this document, but it is very, very much more difficult. I should note this only applies to veterans who made it home alive. Discharge forms were not generated for soldiers and sailors who died during the war. But don't worry, we'll talk about how to get that information a little bit later. So this is my grandpa's discharge form, and I'm going to use it as an example to show you the information it contains. But before we start analyzing this document, we should probably talk about how to get one of these for your ancestor, right? Okay. Now, having just told you that this discharge paper is basically one-stop shopping for finding out about your World War II ancestor, most of you are probably licking your lips and ready to run out and get one. What I am about to say might break your hearts a little bit. Locating one of these for a particular veteran can be very difficult, and the search can be extremely frustrating. I'm going to suggest some of the places you can look for a DD-214, and also some of the problems you might encounter while searching. The first thing to do, if the veteran is still alive, ask him or her if they have a copy of their discharge. If the veteran is deceased, ask their children or other family. If you're lucky, they might have donated it to a good archives where getting a copy would be very easy. Or maybe they kept it themselves and are willing to share it with you. This is probably the quickest and potentially easiest way that you can get a copy of a veteran's separation record. All veterans were given at least one, usually multiple copies of their separation record. The federal government, which issued these forms through the War Department, also kept a copy. So you can write to the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis for a copy of it. And that sounds pretty easy too, right? Well, it would be, except that almost 50 years ago, excuse me, almost 60 years ago, in 1973, a fire at the National Personnel Records Center destroyed almost 20 million records, including an estimated 80% of Army discharge papers that were created from 1912 to 1960. This is an actual picture of that 1973 fire. So if you're researching a World War II Army or Air Force veteran, chances are they are not going to have one. I still recommend asking, because the worst they can do is respond with a form letter saying it was destroyed in a fire. That's what happened to me when I requested my grandfather's DD-214, and it was incredibly frustrating. So just make sure you don't get your hopes up too high. On the other hand, if you're researching a World War II Marine, Navy, Coast Guard, or Merchant Marine veteran, there is a decent chance that they will still have it, as those records reportedly escaped relatively unscathed. In addition, efforts are being made to salvage records and recreate some of those that were destroyed. So it is possible that the NPRC has a record now that they didn't have 10 or 15 years ago. In any case, despite the likelihood that they won't have anything for you, it is still worth asking. Knowing about the fire ahead of time can help you to be prepared for the response, and then you'll be pleasantly surprised if they do have a record for you. There are several other places you can look for a DD-214, though they each will present unique issues of their own. There's a slight chance that the Federal Department of Veterans Affairs will have a copy of your veteran's DD-214 or information similar to what would be found on a DD-214. There's a greater chance that the state Department of Veterans Affairs will have a copy of your veteran's DD-214. The trick here is to check with different states, starting with the state where the veteran was living when he or she was discharged. If the veteran moved to a different state later in life, be sure to check with that state too. Generally speaking, the state VA acquires these when the veteran applies for benefits. So wherever you think the veteran was living when he or she applied for a student loan or a housing loan or medical benefits, be sure to check there. The potential problem with this source is that you might run into confidentiality laws. For example, in the state of Wisconsin, World War II records and later are restricted not just to next of kin, but specifically to the surviving spouse or the adult children. That's how the statute is written. It specifically names the spouse or the adult children. This excludes grandchildren, nieces, nephews, and anyone else, no matter how good their intentions are. Different states have different laws about veterans records, so be sure to check with them and don't assume that they'll all be the same. Okay, so this last suggestion is probably one of the more promising ones and the ones that I recommend to a lot of genealogists who are not the spouse or the child of a World War II veteran. When World War II veterans returned from their service and were discharged, they were encouraged to register a copy of their separation record with the local Register of Deeds. Not all followed that advice, but many did. So contacting the County Register of Deeds in the county where the veteran was living at the time of the war often yields pretty positive results. And although the County Register of Deeds should be bound by the same state laws that prevent the state VA from sharing the record with you, I will repeat that I've heard many success stories from this. I think they are a little bit more likely to share at least some of the information with you, even if you're a grandchild or a niece or a nephew. So to summarize, the family, the National Personnel Record Center, the federal VA, the state VA, and the County Register of Deeds are the best places to look for a World War II veteran's DD-214. And to repeat, this only works for veterans who survived the war and returned home to be discharged. For those who were killed in action or who died of other causes during the war, no discharge form was generated. However, however, there is still a good source of information about them, and I will discuss that now. Finding information about the soldiers and sailors who made the ultimate sacrifice can be even more difficult than tracking down discharge papers for those who made it through the war. A good place to start is to look for an obituary or an article about the death. If you have a date that the service person died, look through microfilm copies of their hometown newspaper for the days and weeks following that date to find an article. They often can include details about the unit they served in, the circumstances surrounding their death, and other useful tidbits. Some local libraries and historical societies have obituary or name indexes that could make your search even easier. Some communities have lists of local men and women who died in military service, so checking with the local library or historical society for that could also bear fruit. There's no guarantee that there will be such an obituary, or even if there is, there's no guarantee that it will have really useful information, but I think this is a good place to start your search. Whether or not you have luck finding an obituary, you will probably also want to request an individual deceased personnel file. And that's fun to say, try saying it 5 times fast. While discharge papers were not produced for soldiers or sailors who died during the war, each branch of service did create a file to track them and the disposition of their remains and their belongings. These files can be a little hit and miss. Some will have a bare minimum of information about the death of the veteran, while others will have a plethora of papers, including letters written by buddies who describe the action in which the soldier died. Contact me if you have questions relating to this, and I'll do my best to get you the most current address. You have to write to the specific branch of service to request an individual deceased personnel file, and those addresses seem to change somewhat regularly, so I'm not even putting it up here because I'm not sure what the current one is. But if you want to pursue this angle, just reach out to me, and I'll do my best to hook you up with the right address. Okay. As long as we're on the topic of death and mortality, I want to quickly talk about burial records and also touch upon obituaries. There are several resources available online that might help you find the burial location of a World War II veteran, whether they died during the war or after a long life as a veteran. Sometimes, in addition to the location of their grave, these sources might provide information about their service, like when they entered and left the military, what unit they served in, and more. Here are a couple of those sources, which are also listed in your pack. Excuse me, pardon me. Here are a couple more of those sources. The American Battle Monuments Commission is an organization that keeps track of all American military personnel who are buried overseas in recognized cemeteries, with an emphasis on World War I and World War II. They have a very nice website, abmc.gov, that is searchable. It's a useful resource that can provide the name, the rank, the branch of service, the unit, the home state, the date and place of death, and awards they earned, as well as the location of their remains. If you think your ancestor is buried overseas, I would definitely recommend searching the American Battle Monuments Commission website. The Federal Department of Veterans Affairs maintains a database of veterans buried in national cemeteries in the United States, state veterans cemeteries, and some private cemeteries. The amount of information provided by this database isn't as good. It's often just the burial location and the dates of birth and death, but sometimes rank and branch of service will show up. And even with limited information, this can be a stepping stone to finding an obituary or other important documents. So if you're having trouble locating information about a deceased veteran, even one who has passed away long after the war, this is a good place to check. Many of you are probably familiar with findagrave.com. It is a pretty incredible resource, and it gets bigger every day. One of the problems with it, of course, is that it relies on the general public to enter information, and thus it is subject to errors, both intentional and unintentional. It is also not a military burials database, so it might not contain any information about the veteran's service. But if it helps you locate the burial place and death date of a World War II veteran in your family tree that you can't find anywhere else, then it's definitely worth it. And again, it can provide a stepping stone to other sources. I use Find a Grave regularly when looking at veterans, so I would recommend using this as well. And finally, for burial records, the Wisconsin Veterans Museum has information about World War II veterans who were buried in Wisconsin. In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs asked all the cemeteries in Wisconsin to send them information about the veterans buried there. Many responded, but not all. We also cannot guarantee that they found every veteran buried in their cemetery, but my museum does have tens of thousands of index cards with information about veterans buried in Wisconsin, many of which were World War II veterans. This isn't available online and probably won't be anytime soon. So if you think your veteran is buried in this state and you're having trouble finding any information on him or her, feel free to send me an email or give me a call and I can check our burial index. I also want to put in one last plug for obituaries. I'm often surprised when talking to genealogists to find out that they haven't looked for an obituary for their ancestor. They are not always full of the information you are looking for, but they often have pieces of it and perhaps point you in a direction you might want to look. For veterans, they will often contain at least a branch of service, and often the theater that they served in, possibly with the unit, and sometimes with information about medals or other honors. In my opinion, it's always worth trying to find the obituary for a veteran in your family tree. Okay, so that was a little bit of a side path we took for a bit. I talked about how you might find a discharge paper or its equivalent if your ancestor died in the war. Once you get a discharge, you're going to be assaulted with some of the strange acronyms and military jargon that I showed at the beginning of my presentation. Using my grandfather's DD-214 as an example, I'm going to go through some of the fields with you and explain what they mean, as well as some sources you can use to find out even more information about them. I want to point out before I start that my grandpa served in the Army. A discharge paper from other Army or Army Air Force veterans should look similar and have similar information. Discharge papers for the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, the Merchant Marines will look different and have slightly different information on them. In my experience, the Army discharge paper tends to be more informative than other branches. If you get a Navy or Marine Corps discharge and need help deciphering it, please feel free to contact me. All right, so zooming in here, let's look at the top section of the discharge paper first. You can see that it has a lot of personal information about him. I'm going to talk about each of these in depth, but first, let's just kind of go through them starting left or right. You can see his name and serial number. I redacted his serial number, not because I thought I needed to, but to demonstrate that some of the institutions that hold these type of records will be very protective of serial numbers and might not be willing to share them with you. It's just something to be prepared for. You can see his rank, arm of service, component, organization, date and place of separation, permanent address, date and place of birth, a physical description, which includes eye and hair color, height and weight, and race, and then vital information about his marital status, citizenship, and occupation. That's a lot of information crammed into a small portion of this document. You can see why it is such an important piece of the puzzle to find when researching a World War II veteran. All of this information is pretty interesting and pretty useful, right? And it's only the beginning. So let's talk about each of these fields, what it tells you about the veteran, and how you can use that information to search for more. So the name, I apologize, I got a little ahead of myself there. The name seems like an obvious piece of information that you probably already have if you're searching for information about an ancestor. But I've definitely encountered genealogists who find a picture of someone in uniform who looks like a family member, or who just want to find out if any ancestors were in the military without having a specific name in mind. Having the name of a veteran can be used to pursue other sources of information as well. Ancestry.com, various online indexes and databases, newspaper indexes, and more. The serial number is a piece of information that will sometimes be redacted from the record you receive, but not always. The serial number is not always terribly useful to genealogists, but it can come in handy, especially when requesting records from federal institutions like the National Archives and the Federal Department of Veterans Affairs. Rank is almost always going to be an abbreviation, some of which are easy to figure out and others which might be pretty difficult. For example, my grandpa's rank was PFC, which stands for Private First Class. An Army, Air Force, or Marine Corps rank won't necessarily tell you much about what your ancestor did on a day-to-day basis, but it will tell you where they stood in the chain of command. There are numerous resources online and in print that can help explain both the abbreviations and what it means in terms of their place. For the Navy, the rank is called rates, and it often does tell you about what the person did for their duties. Rates like electrician, radioman, pharmacist's mate, and torpedoman's mate are pretty descriptive. Others like seaman and yeoman are a little less descriptive, but they are things you can search further for either online or in various printed sources. For Army veterans, Arm of Service will tell you which branch of the Army your ancestor served in. Some examples would be infantry, cavalry, or Army Air Forces. The component field is most often going to have the letters AUS, which stands for Army of the United States. These aren't exactly useless fields for genealogists, but the one I'll talk about next is much better than these two. The organization field might be one of the most useful you'll find on the discharge paper, or it might just cause you a huge amount of frustration. This is where you will find the smaller unit, usually a regiment, and often a company that your ancestor served in during the war. This discharge form will generally show you the unit he or she was with when they were discharged. The potential problem is that sometimes after the war ended, while soldiers were still overseas waiting to be sent home, they were transferred around to different units. Thus, if he or she served the entire war with one unit, but transferred around a little the last 2 months of the war, the record might only list that last unit. This is not generally the case, but it can be, so please be prepared for having to do a little more research. However, assuming that your ancestors served in the same unit throughout the war, this field can lead you to all sorts of interesting information. You can use sources like Shelby Stanton's order of battle for the US Army in World War II to find out more about when the unit was activated, which larger units it was a part of, where it served, battles it was in, and where it was when the war ended. You can also search for regimental histories written about that specific unit, or divisional histories if there are no regimental histories. If you don't have letters or diaries from your ancestor describing what it was like for them in the service, you can search for letters, diaries, or oral history interviews from men who served in the same unit. This is called parallel research, and it can be very rewarding. It is based on the assumption that someone in the same unit as your ancestor experienced the same weather, ate the same food, and likely participated in the same duties and battles. So seeing how they felt about all of that can provide you with insight into how your ancestor felt about it. The Wisconsin Veterans Museum is a great resource for these types of materials, and I encourage you to search our online catalog to see if we have any materials that can help you in your search. You can also explore regimental records from the National Archives. They might contain orders, morning reports, and after action reports that could shed some light on these things that your ancestor did. You'll likely have to travel to DC or hire a researcher to find these records, but you might decide that it's worth it. You can see if there's a divisional or regimental Veterans Association for your ancestors unit. For example, the 32nd Division Veterans Association has recently still been active and can be a source of more information about the unit and possibly individuals who served in it. You can do some internet searching to see if an organization exists and contact them to see the resources that they might have available. As you can see, the organization field is a great starting point for a lot of information about your ancestors' service. Marine Corps records should also list an organization that can be researched in a similar fashion. Navy records, you should look for the names of ships or of naval bases that can also be researched, much like Army units. All right, I'm gonna start, we're running a little low on time here, so I'm gonna start skipping ahead. You can see there's address, date of birth, physical description, which are all, I think, really interesting things to know about your ancestor. We're gonna skip ahead to the middle section here. This is titled Military History, and it contains even more specific information about their service. It's going to tell you when they entered the service, what they did in the military on a daily basis, where they served, and the awards they earned. So I'm just going to kind of scoot through this a little more quickly. So again, toward the top left, you can see the date of induction. Induction means draft. So if there's a date under induction, it means they were drafted. If there's a date under enlistment, it means they volunteered. So that's a way to tell the difference there. One of the important pieces of information this lists is the military occupation specialty. It's often called an MOS. This tells you pretty specifically what the duties of your ancestor were. So light mortar crewman means that he was part of a small group of men who operated a light mortar. It might say clerk, it might say rifleman, it might say some other things. Some are more helpful than others, but that's what that means. Battles and campaigns is really interesting, I think, for a lot of folks. We mentioned the common questions asked, one of which was what battles did they serve in? This will list the names of kind of official army or military campaigns. So it might say from Europe, it might say Northern France, Ardennes, Normandy, in the Pacific. My grandpa says Eastern Mandates. It might say Philippines or other things like that. Decoration, and of course you can do more research on those. Decorations and citations, this is where it's going to list the medals that they earned. My grandpa was wounded in Saipan, so he has a Purple Heart. Generally they'll have a ribbon from the theater they served in if they earned a Silver Star or a Bronze Star. If they earned any sort of foreign medal, it would list it in this field. You can see the wounds received, obviously, and then there are immunizations, which doesn't necessarily help you a whole lot, but I always think is kind of interesting. And then over on the right-hand side toward the middle, this can be of interest. It tells you when they departed for overseas, where they went, and also when they came back home. So if you're wondering how long your ancestors spent overseas, this can be useful for that. All right. And then the bottom of the DD-214 is probably not quite as interesting. Not necessarily useful in finding out more about their service. It just talks about kind of their pay and insurance that they might have served, that sort of thing. So that's a quick rundown of a DD-214. And again, this probably will answer a lot of the questions you have, and it also provides you with a basis of information that you can use to go look for more information. And again, our museum can help you with that. I do want to mention that over 300,000 women served in the United States military during World War II, especially since we're in March, Women's History Month. While they had served in World War I, their duty had been very limited to mostly nurses. In World War II, they filled many different roles in all different branches. The largest number of women served in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which in 1943 changed its name to just the Women's Army Corps. Other female branches included the Navy's WAVES, which stood for Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service. The Army Air Force's WASPs, which stood for Women Air Force Service Pilots. And the Marines, well, the Marines called their women Marines. Female Marines didn't have a catchy acronym like the other branches, but some of these women flew airplanes stateside, repaired military vehicles and machinery, and helped crack encoded enemy messages, as well as fill roles like typists, clerks, and nurses. Women served overseas as well as stateside. Their main purpose was to replace a man who could then be sent to the front lines, but they exceeded expectations and played a very vital role in the war effort. Many of these women were not officially recognized as veterans until decades after the war, but those battles were won, and today they are full veterans. Because of that, finding out about their service is today very similar to finding out about a male veteran's World War II service. Try to get a copy of their discharge form and follow the same steps. There are organizations like American Women Veterans that can help you, and many states have women veteran coordinators who can help you in your search. All right, so that covers the discharge record, the best source of information you'll find for a World War II veteran. I sincerely hope you can all find one for the veteran in your family tree. If you cannot, there are still some other ways to get some of this information, and I'm going to quickly run through them. If you have photos of the veteran in uniform, or if you have their uniform, the insignia patch on their left shoulder can give you clues to the unit they served in. So again, this is my grandfather, and you can see on his left shoulder, he has a colored patch, which you can't make out super well from this scan, but when you look a little bit closer at it, you can tell that it's a 27th Division patch. So just this photograph, without any other information about this person, you already can narrow it down to one of the almost 100 Army divisions from World War II, which makes your search a lot easier moving forward. Okay. If you have letters written by the veteran, look on the envelopes for their return address, and it will often list the unit that they served in. Also, many veterans discuss their unit, rank, and other details either at the beginning or end of their letters, so check those areas out too. Any sort of military papers you might have relating to your ancestor, like orders, promotions, even records relating to training, could have clues about their broader service. Family lore, if taken with a grain of salt, can also be helpful in providing clues that you can then explore further and find documented evidence for. In other words, use everything you have to look for clues and don't be afraid to ask for help. I've tried to show you today that the World War II military is a complex subject and you shouldn't expect to understand it all. So get help from someone who maybe understands it a little better. And don't stop when you find out a little. As I mentioned, there are regimental histories, county veterans lists, oral history interviews, and more that can help you find out even more about your ancestor. Okay, I think we are right about at 50 minutes, so I'm gonna stop here and say that I hope you got some useful information out of this. I hope maybe I turned you on to a new source or two, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have. So please feel free.
Wow, thank you so much, Russ. This was definitely an informative presentation. I'm so glad that I have at least one of my ancestors' DD 214 forms because it is very informative.
Yeah.
Questions, I'll go through some of them. Someone was asking, can we send a copy of a DD 214 to the National Archives to help them reconstruct their records of our ancestors if we have a copy of it?
I can't answer that question for them, but I don't know that it could hurt. I would maybe try to contact them before you send it in. Also, I'm very much in favor of local sources. So if you have a DD 214 for your ancestor, I would make sure that the state has a copy. In Wisconsin, every county has someone called a county veteran service officer. And that would be a great place to start. Just make sure that they have a copy of it, and maybe they can filter it up to the National Archives. But I wouldn't recommend just blindly sending a DD 214 to the National Archives. I have no idea what they would do with it.
See our next question. Do you need to be a close relative to request the deceased personnel file?
I don't believe so, no, because I've requested one for a veteran that we have in our collection, and I'm not related to them at all. I think they're available via Freedom of Information Act. And actually, that's a good question that allows me to talk about this. So I mentioned that in the state of Wisconsin, World War II records are still confidential. I also mentioned that different states have different rules, but federally speaking, from a federal level, I believe they protect them for about 60 years and then they're open. So federally, World War II records are completely open to the public. But what I've learned is that, at least for my purposes, state law supersedes federal law. So I can't share World War II records with folks, but the federal government can. So to answer that question specifically, you do not have to be a close veteran to request an individual deceased personnel file. And more broadly, federally, World War II records are completely open.
And then someone was asking, did World War I have those individual deceased files as well?
Not to my knowledge. We have World War I records for Wisconsin soldiers, Wisconsin men and women, and the same type of record was created for deceased people as for those who survived the war. So if you have a relative from Wisconsin who died during World War I, we should be able to supply you with that record. Or if it's from a different state, I would contact that state's historical society or veterans museum.
And then another World War I question, did they have DD-214s or did they have like a similar form that we should request?
Yeah, it wasn't called a DD-214, but it's a similar service record kind of thing. Again, we have them for all the 122,000 Wisconsin men and women who served in World War I. I would guess that each state kind of has their own. If you just ask for a service record or something along those lines, you should be able to find it.
And there was an acronym, MOS. What does that stand for?
Sure, that stands for Military Occupation Specialty. I think I might have mentioned that when I was quickly going through the DD-214 line by line. So that the MOS, or the Military Occupation Specialty, is kind of is that person's specific role in the military. So it might say clerk, it might say truck driver, it might say rifleman. My grandpa said light mortar crew. It's just going to tell you a little more specifically maybe what they did on a day-to-day basis.
Our next question. My dad was in World War II Army Air Corps. Will records be in both Army and Air Force records or just in the Army?
That's a good question. So in terms, assuming that your father survived the war, the branch is sort of irrelevant. Going to the sources that I talked about, the National Personnel Record Center, the state VA, or the county register of deeds, they're going to have it or not have it regardless of what branch he was in. So in terms of finding a DD-214 for someone who survived the war, branch is a little bit irrelevant. It only really comes into play if the person died during the war, in which case you have to request an individual deceased personnel file, and that does have to be requested from the specific branch of service. For World War II, I would guess that the Army Air Force records were separated to the Air Force when it became a separate branch. So I would probably recommend starting with the Air Force directly.
Oh, good. All right. Is there a difference between a Bronze Star and a Bronze Star Medal?
Yeah, that can be. I'm going to see if I can back up. Fancy. Okay, don't anyone get dizzy. I'm going to just try to get back to the DD-214, this middle section here. So in the middle there, section 33, it shows decorations and citations. So you can see that my grandfather says on the second line, Asiatic Pacific Theater ribbon with 1 battle star. Sometimes it'll say with 1 bronze star or with 2 bronze stars. If you imagine a dress uniform, well, let me see here. I don't know where the picture of my grandpa is. When you picture the uniform and they have all these colored ribbons right here, those ribbons represent different things. And as I mentioned, usually they have a ribbon for the theater in which they served. If they participated in battles, they will get a star for each battle they served in on that ribbon. So my grandfather, if you look in the field just above, was in 1 campaign. So he has 1 battle star. And again, sometimes those are called, I think they get called bronze stars in these. The Bronze Star Medal is a different thing. That is a medal for valor. That is specifically for something out of the ordinary that your ancestor did. You think of the Medal of Honor, that's the highest military award that someone can get. Then there are things like the Distinguished Service Cross or Distinguished Flying Cross, Silver Star Medal, and Bronze Star Medal. So yes, if it says Bronze Star Medal, that's a Valor Award. If it just says Bronze Star or Battle Star, that is most likely just reflective of the fact that they served in a battle.
For World War II Navy records, where's the first place this person should start searching?
So if you're looking for a discharge from the Navy, really, I would say probably the first 2 places I would try, depending on how you are related to that person, would be either the state VA. Again, if you figure out where that person was living after their service, where they might have applied for benefits, go to that state's VA, or I'm really starting to side more toward the county level. Wherever that veteran was living at the time of their service, there's a very strong chance that they deposited a copy of their discharge at the county level when they got home. So figure out where they were living, go to that county seat, and the county register of deeds there might well have a copy of their discharge.
Yeah, and this person says it's his father, so he should have an easy time hopefully getting access to that record.
Yeah, if you're the child of a veteran, then you could also try the state VA, and regardless of what sort of laws they have in place, the child of a veteran should be able to get a copy of it.
Are there special records for airborne rangers?
Nope. They would have a discharge just like the one we've been looking at. I mean, it would obviously have some different acronyms and information on it, but yeah, no, it would be very similar to this.
All right. Is there a place which lists the draft numbers in the order that they were called for in World War II?
I don't really know the answer to that question. The draft is not something we have a lot of records on. I would, for information about the draft, I would consider trying the State Historical Society in whichever state you're interested in. I think the way that the draft was administered was almost more of a civil thing than a military thing. So that's the route I would probably take. Try your, whatever state you're interested in, try that State Historical Society.
Okay. If your ancestor moved around to various units, how do you track the units they moved through?
That's a really good question, and it's one of the most frustrating things that I've run into and that I've seen people run into. Honestly, a really good way to try to do that is through newspapers. Local newspapers loved to write little articles and updates about local men and women in the service during World War II. And a lot of times, if they changed units, if they wrote a letter home, that would be a chance for them to print a little update like that. So, and obviously the smaller the town, the smaller the newspaper, the more likely it is that you'll find something about your ancestor. So contact the public library in that area, see if they have the newspaper on microfilm. And it might be a little putsy, it might be a little time consuming, but just kind of scanning through the World War II years looking for those updates can sometimes really turn up some incredible results. Beyond that, it can be really difficult. If you have an individual who you're encountering that problem with, maybe just contact me and we can try to work through it. But I don't know that there's a tried and true way to do it, especially with the fire at the National Personnel Record Center. That would normally be the place that you would go to find that information, but so much of it was destroyed that it just makes it a lot more difficult.
Someone said in the chat that the morning reports would also give a change of units. So how would we access morning reports?
Morning reports would be located at the National Archives. They would be part of the regimental records. I think I mentioned that really briefly. Generally speaking, it means you'll have to go to the National Archives yourself, or they have lists of researchers who are willing to do that sort of thing. So you could pay a researcher to do it for you. But yeah, I mean, for folks who are able to do that, that would be a great source of information, would be morning reports, after action reports from the National Archives.
And someone else typed in chat that she sent for her father's medals, and there were some that he never got or requested. So do you know anything about that? Like how people would check to see if their deceased ancestor had any medals that they never claimed?
Yeah, so I mean, as you can see on the screen here, their discharge form should list all of the awards that they're entitled to. Sometimes after the war, new medals are created or become available that they might be eligible for. For instance, going back to World War I again, the Purple Heart did not exist during World War I. There was not a Purple Heart medal, so it was created, I think, in the early 1930s. So World War I veterans who had been wounded don't have a Purple Heart listed as a medal that they earned, but after the medal was created, they could apply for one retroactively. So what I would recommend, I guess, one would be to get a copy of their discharge form and see which medals are listed there. And then I know, at least in Wisconsin, the Department of Veterans Affairs has folks who work on this sort of thing, who help families get replacement medals or medals like that. So I would recommend contacting the state VA for help getting those medals.
Cool. Next question: why are the wounds received not listed? I think on the DD 214 form they're talking about.
Oh, like a description of the wounds, maybe they mean?
Possibly, they didn't say.
Yeah, I'm going to guess that's what because as you can see on field 34 here, it does say the date and the place that he was wounded, or at least generally. I mean, okay, so I think what you have to do a little bit is give a little grace to the military. There were, what, 16 million people that they had to keep track of, and you have to remember this was in the middle of a world war. So the fact that they didn't write down my grandpa was shot through the knee on Saipan, it might be that when whoever was discharging him, they had a million discharges to get through that day and they just couldn't keep track of it. There are definitely instances where information is not passed along maybe as efficiently as we would like, but again, this is where you can maybe, the discharge form can give you the date. You could then look through the local newspaper. So my grandpa's from Oshkosh. I would, if I was researching him and trying to figure out how he was wounded, I would contact the Oshkosh Public Library. I would get the Oshkosh Northwestern on microfilm, and starting with July 4th, 1944, I would start skimming through after that and looking for an article that Mr. and Mrs. Lewis Norkowski received word that their son was wounded on Saipan. And I would guess that at some point in the Northwestern, it's going to say that he was shot in the leg, and that's how you can start filling in those details.
Our next question: where can I look to find out what ship my father served on?
Okay, so assuming your father was in the Navy, I don't have a picture of a Navy discharge form, but just get the blowout view here. Yeah, sorry. Again, I apologize for anyone who's getting motion sick. Okay, so this is a zoom out on the Army discharge form. The Navy discharge form, again, is going to look a little bit different. It's in blue ink, oddly enough. But on the right-hand side, kind of around the middle on the right-hand side, it will list the ships they served on or the stations they were at. So it might say Great Lakes, maybe they started out training there. It might say NAS, which is a Naval Aviation Station. But it also, if they were on a ship, it should list the ships, USS Wisconsin, USS whatever. And then you can, again, use that information to do a little research on what maybe that ship was up to during the war. But it should, right on the Navy discharge form, it should list any ships they served on.
Our next question: my grandfather was in the Army Medical Corps. Besides his discharge papers, which I already have, where else could I find information about his service?
Well, I mean, at this point, I guess I'd maybe email me a copy of the discharge. One of the things I was trying to get through this afternoon was that, this information can be super helpful, but it also can provide you with different places to look. So, if it lists his unit, we might be looking for a unit history or a divisional history. If it lists battles and campaigns that he was in, maybe we're going to start looking for books about those battles and figuring out or combine those two and figure what his unit did in that battle. There's a lot of different directions we can go. It just becomes a little more just looking into different sources from there.
Our next question: my grandfather was in the Army and on LST-282 that was bombed on August 15th, 1944. Is there a good place to find records from the service about that incident?
So, yeah, I think that again, using that date, you could, and even the ship, the Navy there's a lot of information about individual Navy ships online. If you search that LST, I'm guessing that you can find a lot of information about it. If you need help, contact me, but I'm trying to think of what the website is. There's a particular website that is just an incredible source of information about individual Navy ships. It has usually photographs and it has a history of what happened to it. So I think that information should be pretty easily accessible. If you need some help, just give me a holler and I can point you in the right direction.
Our next question, is it true that the museum is no longer accepting World War II medal collections of veterans?
No, I would say that's not true. Our museum, what we try to do is we try to preserve the stories of individual veterans. Our motto is that every veteran is a story. So whether a veteran participated in battle, whether they sat behind a desk with a typewriter in the States throughout the war, we think their story is unique and worthy of preserving. So we look for things that help us to tell a unique story. Often we get offered dress uniforms and we get offered medals. And sometimes we accept them if we feel that they help tell that veteran's unique story. But sometimes they don't help us tell that unique story. Dress uniforms really are pretty much the same all around, and it's not something that they wore on a daily basis. And medals, the theater ribbons, those sorts of things, it tells you that they served in that theater, but it doesn't tell you very much about them as an individual. So there are times where we decline to accept World War II medals, but we love to hear about them. And sometimes, a lot of the time, actually, people, when they come to us with an offer of a dress uniform, we might say no, but we might have a conversation with them then and say, what else do you have? Do you have any letters they wrote? Do you have a photograph of them? And those are things that are unique and individual and help us tell their story. So please don't ever feel like you shouldn't contact us with something you're interested in potentially offering to us, because again, that connection and that conversation we can have often ends up working out really well for both parties.
And I'd also suggest, if the Veterans Museum doesn't accept it, definitely look at a local historical society. They would probably, gladly accept it, especially if the veteran lived in that area for a long time. I think that is all of our questions that we have for today. Here, just one more came in. Let's see. Are there any other ways to track an Army company other than the morning report? This person said that they've tried through a military specialist and had no luck.
So it's hard to give a blanket answer to that because the Army has so many different kinds of units, and some of them are super easy to track and some of them are not very easy to track. So my grandpa was in Company A of the 106th Infantry Regiment. Infantry regiments are generally pretty easy to track. When you start getting into specialized units, they can be a little bit more difficult, but in general, in theory, you would figure out, for the most part, companies did the same thing that the regiment did. Companies did not get split off super often, at least not drastically different than what the other companies in that regiment did. So really, you're looking for the regiment's history, and that's what I would recommend. Try to figure out which regiment he was in, see if there's a history of that regiment. If there's not, figure out which division that regiment was a part of, and maybe try to find a divisional history. Again, it can be super easy. Sometimes it can be super difficult. And if you're running into a brick wall, feel free to reach out and contact me and we can maybe figure something out together.
All right. And then someone's asking, can you get medals replaced if they've gotten lost since the person had died?
Yeah, again, I would recommend contacting the state Veterans Affairs. I know that in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs has folks who help families get replacement medals. That's definitely a very real possibility. So I would work through the state VA. Otherwise, sometimes local American Legion posts or county veteran service officers can help with that as well.
Great. Well, those are all the questions we had. Thank you again so much, Russ. I really appreciate your time and your knowledge. I'm excited to dive into my World War II ancestors story. So I hope a lot of other people enjoyed and learned a lot. There's lots of comments in the chat throughout that this was a wonderful presentation and people learned a lot. So hopefully everyone can join us next month on April 17th, where we're going to be talking about researching your UK and Irish roots online. And again, the registration link is in the handout for that. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon and have a great afternoon.